I've just sat down to start this video tutorial, but there's something not quite right and I can't really put my finger on it. Wait a minute. That's much better. In this latest episode of the Basics of Photography with Yorkshire Photo Walks, we're going to be helping you to perfect your black and white photography skills. When you think of black and white photography, you might think back to the good old days when, quite simply, it was the only choice that we had. But even since the advent of colour, black and white has still remained a stronghold within the photographic industry. And personally, I think that's a really good thing, because black and white photographs do things that colour photographs simply can't even achieve. Instead of looking at colour contrasts, we're forced to look at tonal contrast, which can completely change the way that we look at the subject that's being photographed. So in this video, I'm going to run through two different ways we can effectively turn our photographs black and white. We'll start off with in-camera settings, and then we'll move on to post-production. It may surprise you when I say that when all digital cameras make a photograph, they make it in black and white first of all. The manufacturers pack the camera body and sensor with technology that automatically transfers that black and white image into a colour photograph that we see on the screen on the back of the camera. So how, using our camera settings alone, can we get back to that original black and white photograph? Well, usually most modern digital cameras have a list of colour presets. You'll see things like vivid, neutral, portraiture, landscape, that sort of thing. And on that list there'll be one option that says monochrome or black and white. If you select this option, depending on the level of camera you have, you may even be able to access a sub-menu where you'll be able to tweak the contrast, clarity and sharpness of your black and white photograph. Now, it's worth playing around with these depending on what subject you're photographing and achieving the best thing that you can find that tailors to your own personal view of what black and white photography should be. On some digital cameras you'll also find a colour filter setting within this sub-menu, and you might think, well, why would I want a colour filter? I'm taking a black and white photograph. But this harps back to the days of film black and white photography, when photographers would physically put filters onto their lenses of different shades of colour to block out certain wavelengths of light. And the effect that this has is it brings out the luminance or the brightness of certain colours. So for example, you are photographing a landscape. Then if you set the red colour filter in your digital camera, then the greens within that landscape will just seem to pop a bit more and give you a bit more contrast to work with. Now, one of the things that we've got to be careful of with these camera presets is that on a lot of cameras they just work on JPEG files, and if you want to fine-tune and post-produce your photographs afterwards, then this isn't always the best option to go for. If you've got a really modern up-to-date camera with really modern up-to-date software, then it should transfer the preset across, but if not, that's definitely something to be wary of. So if you've got one of these cameras where you can't transfer the preset of your camera onto your post-production software, you've got two options. Either you can keep the original JPEG black and white photograph from your camera, and that's the final photograph, or you can use your imagination whilst you're out in the field. Take a colour photograph using a RAW file and then transfer that RAW file to black and white in post-production afterwards. Both have their downfalls, both have their merits, but it's a choice that I think you've got to make personally. So in the next part of the video, we're going to go onto the computer and see how we can change a photograph to black and white using post-production software. So here we are in our post-production screen. I'm using Adobe Lightroom CC for this. If you haven't already seen my video on basic post-production, then please go and have a look at that first if you are unfamiliar with post-production things, because I will probably run through things quite quickly in this video that I cover in a lot more detail in the other one. So let's go about starting to make this photograph black and white and look at the ways that we can do it using post-production software. What a lot of people might think of doing first is going down to this colour panel down here and selecting saturation and turning that right down, which, as you can see, it works perfectly. It's turned the photograph black and white. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't give us the ability to work with the colour that's already there. So down here you can see we've got a colour mixer, which gives you the difference between hue, saturation and luminance with different colour channels from red right through to pinky, purpley, magenta. So what that allows us to do is have our whole photograph black and white, but it also allows us to change the brightness and also the saturation of colours that are in the photograph, even though we can't see them, which has a great effect on the contrast and overall look of the photograph. So in Lightroom, what I'm going to do is go up to the very top of the Edits panel and click on black and white. And that's going to turn the photograph black and white. I'm also just going to make a few subtle adjustments to the photograph itself, just to bring a bit of contrast and detail into it and make sure that the sky looks as brooding as it did before I loaded all of these settings onto it. I'm also going to add a linear gradient on the sky just to emphasize that brooding nature of it. Taking it down to about there. It's looking okay. I may also pull up a few of the shadows underneath the arches of the viaduct as well, just to bring a bit of life back in there. As I say, all of this that I'm doing here is covered in the earlier post-production video, so if you think, I'm adept, what on earth's he doing, then go and check that out and everything will be explained. So we're starting to get here quite a nice looking black and white photograph of the Ribblehead Viaduct. The one thing that I would say when it comes to black and white post-production is don't be scared to go a bit further with the texture and clarity sliders than you would do with a colour photograph. If I revert back to colour to keep those settings, as you can see, the colours are starting to look really false, too vibrant in my opinion, and the photograph just looks a bit chocolate boxy. But if I turn it to black and white, you can see that it is emphasizing all the different parts of contrast within the photograph, which boosts the overall image. So now I'm going to go down to this black and white mixer, which automatically appeared when I turned it black and white. And you'll see that the red channel won't do very much at all because there aren't very many reds in there. But as soon as we move down to the oranges and yellows, we start to see, if I do that, you can see the pulsing of the light under the viaduct. So if we push that up quite a bit, then you get a lot more detail under the arches. Equally the yellow, you can see the difference in the tones in the grass, and the greens as well for the tones in the grass. And what I tend to do usually is push the greens one way and push the yellows slightly in the opposite direction. So
With that, you can see we've emphasised the shadow of the viaduct on the grass a lot more. And we've also picked up a lot more of the detail in the grasses themselves. Now, the aqua and the blue channel will affect the sky. Now, it always depends on how far you want to go with this. Some people like the sky to be really black. As you can see, the aqua's not doing very much, just subtle. But then with the blue, that turns it completely black. Now, I like a reasonably naturally looking blue sky in my photographs, even when it's black and white. So I don't want to go too far, but somewhere to about there just gives it a bit more detail and gives the clouds around it a bit of contrast as well. The purple and magenta sliders, in this case, they're not going to do anything because there isn't any purple or magenta in the photograph. So just to summarise on that, as I look back on what we came from there to that photograph there, remember to push the contrast, because in black and white photographs that's exactly what we're looking for, a lot of contrast. So that includes boosting the contrast slider and also splitting the highlights and shadows, but not too much, so you get those what I call post-production halos, which again I covered in that previous video. Splitting the whites and black sliders, i.e. pushing the whites up and pulling the blacks back, also has a great effect. And also using those colour channels behind the black and white photograph to intensify the contrast even more. Again, don't be scared of pushing the texture and clarity sliders further than you would do for a regular colour photograph, because it just intensifies that clarity and intensifies the contrast without making the photograph look too false.
Black and white photography done well can be absolutely stunning. It's down to your personal preference whether you choose to do it in the camera or in post-production software, or my personal preference, a bit of both. One important thing to stress at this point about black and white photography is never be scared of adding more contrast. Black and white photography is all about contrast, and there's nothing worse than a very misty looking flat black and white photograph, because it's just going to look unfinished and unprofessional. So make sure that you push the contrast as far as you can, whether that's choosing high contrast scenes whilst you're out in the field or playing about with the photograph in post-production afterwards. I hope you're now a bit more clued up when it comes to making black and white photographs. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. If you have, then please like it and subscribe to the Yorkshire Photo Walks channel on YouTube, and keep an eye on YorkshirePhotoWalks.com for our tuition out in the field. Once this lockdown that I'm currently filming this in is finished, we will be getting back out there and doing more practical black and white photography photo walks. So look out for those, and you might be able to join us out in the field very soon. But until then, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again later.